Hello. For this summer's latest, and rather late, episode of the Heirs for Architecture podcast, I spoke to the writer Michael Euade to discuss his 2023 book, Antoni Gaudí, part of Reaction Book's Critical Lives series. Gaudí has recently been beatified by the Catholic Church, making him one step short of being declared a saint. But for what? Gaudí is unquestionably a monumental figure in the pantheon of named architects, but saintly? That's a bit different. Gaudí, whose work is characterised by a genuinely unique vision blending Gothic, Baroque and Orientalist elements with great style, was a man of what some see as contrasts: devoutly religious, politically conservative, and decidedly innovative. Michael and I discussed this in the context of Gaudí's place in Catalonia, both as a geography and as an imaginary, and the role Gaudí played and still plays in defining this. Opening up, I hope, the architect in new ways, as political, social, cultural, and spiritual figure.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Michael Euade. Michael is a writer, and we're going to be talking today about your reaction book, Antoni Gaudí, which you published January 2024. It's a beautiful book, and it's a biography and a study in many ways, and we'll get to that. But Michael, I ask all my guests this. Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Well, my name's Michael. You've already covered that. I've lived in Catalonia, which is Barcelona. It's the capital of Catalonia. Barcelona is presumably better known than the area of which it's the capital. I lived there for 35 years. Before that, I lived in Canterbury and then in Bristol. And really, I did all sorts of jobs until I would always with an ambition to write novels and rather than non-fiction books. But I always wanted to write stuff, and really not until I was about 50, about 25 years ago, did I start publishing anything. And then mainly they've been books and articles on Catalonia, the intersection of politics and literature especially. I mean, I learned left-wing politics in post-1968 in Canterbury, and it hasn't ever really left me. So I sort of, those are my two main interests: literature and politics. Proust and Lenin, as someone said.
Ah, I see. What drew you to Catalonia?
It was accidental. I was thinking of going to Madrid, but I knew some people who lived in Catalonia, and they invited me to stay for a few weeks there, which was good. And that, you know, I like the city and I stayed, but it was purely accidental.
And 35 years is a long accident.
Yeah, it's a life, really. You go. I mean, I went thinking, oh, I can, live here for a year or two, like many people do. In fact, you get a lot of British people, a lot of foreigners coming to Barcelona who stay for a year or two. And then I'll go back and really sort myself out and find out what I'm going to do in Bristol or in Britain. And I stayed. I got involved in close relationship, which has lasted till now, and got involved with political life. Got very interested in Catalan life. I came to realize that Catalonia was a nation 500-600 years ago of some influence in the Mediterranean, which I was completely ignorant of. And I think most visitors and tourists are probably pretty ignorant of the prominence of Catalonia. It was sort of, along with Genoa and Alexandria, it was Venice, it was one of the great cities of the Mediterranean, great trading cities with something of an empire. So, and all that has been, Catalan nationalism has been in the news quite recently with the independence movement. So I got involved in learning about that and getting very interested in that. And the whole question of Gaudi, I suppose, comes out of that interest, really.
I'm very interested in this idea of Catalonia as a distinct territory. You know, there are independence movements, obviously, in the UK. And obviously we know of the Catalonian independence movement, but as you say, I hadn't realized that Catalonia was itself a kingdom, so to speak. What period was that from, and how did that come to an end?
Well, all this is quite controversial. You'll find a lot of Spanish people, Spanish nationalists perhaps, who would completely disagree with what most Catalan nationalists or Catalan independentists would say. The period, to answer your question, is of Catalan's glory was really the 13th and 14th centuries. It was part of the crown of Aragon, which consisted of a sort of composite monarchy, really, of Aragon, whose capital is Saragossa, Valencia, whose capital is Valencia, and Catalonia, whose capital is Barcelona. And Barcelona was the capital of the crown of Aragon, which often does cause controversy because a lot of Spanish nationalists will say, well, Catalonia had nothing to do with it. Catalonia wasn't an independent state. Nations didn't exist then, but one called it a nation because of people's identity with the territory and so on, but it was a state. But it was the crown of Aragon, and it conquered the Mediterranean, conquered Sicily, conquered Naples, conquered Athens for a period in the 14th century in the name of Aragon, but Barcelona was always the principal city. And what I tend to say in arguing with the people is if you go to the Plaza del Rey, which is the King's Square, which is one of the main central squares in Barcelona, you find there the archive of the Crown of Aragon, which is still there. And so the monarchs of, or the rulers, they were known as the Counts of Barcelona. The archive of the Crown of Aragon was in Barcelona, which represents quite graphically, and it's still there, quite graphically, that Barcelona was the capital of this composite entity or state. I'm not sure people talked about states at that time.
Antoni Gaudí was obviously very proud Catalan nationalist.
Yeah.
Which makes sense of your interest in him. And you've talked about sort of politics and Catalonia as being your principal interest. Your book comes out with reaction books in their Critical Lives series, and that features in that series subjects like Carl Jung and Franz Kafka and Roland Barthes and people like
all sorts of people.
But it seems strange to me, particularly from the perspective of an architect, to think of Gaudi within that kind of company. How did you come to be writing about someone who, from the architectural perspective, is really a sort of artist and auteur and a significant cultural figure, but not really, I suppose, commonly seen as being political?
I think the people at Reaction wanting a Critical Lives section, I emphasize, as I will emphasize again to you, I'm no architect and no expert in architecture, but they wanted to go beyond the image and the fame of Gaudi and to look at his background, to look at where he came from, to look at the context in which he grew up, and also to be fairly critical of someone who tends to be revered. Gaudi himself didn't write anything. I mean, there's one known article of his in a newspaper, and some extracts of a diary, but very little. And all we know about Gaudi, obviously there are documents, but much of what we know about Gaudi comes from younger acolytes, often architecture students or usually architects, much younger people, who wrote down what Gaudi said. And so obviously that's very much at second hand. And they tended to greatly admire this grand figure. And I think the purpose of the book a bit was to try and write a little bit critically about Gaudi, not glorify him, not to get a bit beyond the praise which his followers have always heaped on him. And especially the Catholic followers. I mean, nowadays, as you probably know, came out quite recently, he's in line for possible sainthood. And his Catholic followers have been pushing for that for some time. And for them, he's a potential saint, and he'll probably get there, which doesn't say anything about his rather bad-tempered behavior on many occasions, about the somewhat unpleasant character he was, about the rather strange person he was. And all of that is quite interesting. And I probably haven't quite answered your question, but there are in the series quite a few artists. There's other people like Miro and other architects like Frank Lloyd Wright. And basically, I think it's just that, to write something fairly brief, which is not hagiographic.
Mm. What was the context in which Gaudi emerged as an architect? I mean, he was born when?
1852.
1852. And was he very much of his time? Was there a strong movement within Catalonia and within the architectural milieu in which he was positioned, which meant that he was a sort of natural outcropping or one of a kind, obviously a very special one, but nonetheless characteristic of his time in Barcelona?
One of a kind, obviously, but very characteristic. I mean, born in 1852, the 1860s and the 1870s were the time of tremendous cultural movements in Catalonia, celebrations of poetry, looking back to medieval times when Catalonia was great, and walking out, as Gaudi did with his friends, even when he was 16, 17 years old, walking out of his home, spending days out in the country, camping or staying in cheap inns, to look at ruins, to appreciate what Catalonia had been. He was very much part of what was known as the Renaissance or rebirth movement of the time. And he was very much of a generation of architects. The School of Architecture in Barcelona, I think Gaudi, if I got it right, was entered in the second year into the School of Architecture. I actually entered the second year into Canterbury University, but I wasn't at the same level as Gaudi. He was the second year of the newly founded School of Architecture. The building's still there, right in the center of Barcelona, a neo-Gothic building. And he and his contemporaries were imbued with recovering lost medieval glories. But they also had the good fortune that Catalonia's nationalists and its nationalist politicians started off as a cultural movement, then became in the late 19th century a political movement. They were looking to the future. They weren't explicitly talking of independence, but they're looking for a more and more powerful Catalonia. And Catalonia was the leading industrial center of a Spanish state, of Spain. Madrid was a bureaucratic center based on a military, based on big estates, landowners. Catalonia was where the Spanish and the Basque Country was where the Spanish Industrial Revolution took off. And there was money around. These magnates, the city walls, the old city walls had come down in 1859, and they were wanting to build a new, bigger city, new factories, immigrants flooding in from the Catalan Aragonese countryside and later from southern and western Spain. But it was a time of tremendous upheaval. It was also, interrupt me, I may be rattling on, it was also a time of political upheaval because the monarchy was overthrown. I mean, imagine in Britain, if we overthrow the monarchy, it'd be a big upheaval. And it was in Spain as well. In 1868, the monarchy was overthrown and a republic was proclaimed. And so the Catalans, within that context, time of great upheaval, time of right through Europe, it was a time of new nation states, the Greek nation, the Italian Carbonari movement, all sorts of effervescence in which young people, young men in particular, like Gaudi, grew up. So he grew up very much in this, schooled in Spanish, because all schooling was in Spanish, because Catalan had been forbidden in public discourse, but talking Catalan in the home, and more throughout his life talking Catalan in public, insisting on the validity of Catalan, insisting that it was an entity which was superior in his view, in his nationalist view, to a rather backward Spanish state.
Very interesting. This looking backwards that you mentioned, this kind of looking backwards and forwards at the same time, it's slightly different to the kind of higher movement within Victorian Britain of people like Morris and Pugin and Ruskin, who are looking backwards to a kind of perhaps a crafted medieval thing. This is a kind of more akin, I suppose, to what Scotland has been trying to achieve in its assertion of its national identity, a sort of modernized heritage.
Yeah, I think that's quite a good term, modernized heritage. It hadn't occurred to me, but one thing is to acclaim that we were a great nation when Madrid was just a windswept village on a plain.
Mm.
We were trading with Alexandria and Geneva and conquering Sicily. We were a great nation. So that's the looking back. And because we're a great nation, we can be great again.
Mm.
And we're great again because we're manufacturing, were wealthier. The coast of Spain, Valencia, Basque Country, Barcelona have always been the richest parts of a fairly impoverished state until recent decades. So I think that looking back fits in very well with trying to build a future.
Mm.
And there's a lot of ambivalence in Gaudi, obviously, because he was very much into what we could call arts and crafts in craft manufacture. But of course, the money and the prestige, the money which financed his extravagant buildings came from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, to put it crudely, came from slavery, came from cotton. In the question of Catalonia, it came from slave owners in Cuba. His great patron, Euade, was the son of a Cuban slave owner who sugar, tobacco, especially cotton. The money came back to be invested in the factories of Catalonia's Industrial Revolution. I mean, that happened all over Europe. So there was a lot of ambivalence in that. But I think also you would know 100 times more about this than me, but very influential in the Barcelona School of Architecture and on Gaudi was Viollet-le-Duc, the French architect. And Gaudi ended up considering a poor architect, but a great influence, a great intellectual. And what he took from Viollet was look at Gothic and deconstruct Gothic. And Gaudi actually deconstructed it by going to ruins and looking at the ruins, seeing, how the stones which had been fallen down, how eventually, how previously they'd been put up. And Viollet also said, correct me if I'm wrong, deconstruct Gothic, but reconstruct it with modern methods, use modern methods. Don't go back to just building in what you had in the 14th century, blocks of stone carved by people's hand labor. But look at the latest developments in iron structure, the latest developments in paving. I've gone a bit blank. I've thought in my mind there's 5 or 6 elements there which Gaudi views as very modern elements, industrially created elements. One of his very interesting things, just to finalize this little bit, is that in one of his houses, his first big house in Barcelona, Casa Vicens, was a famous palm leaf fence, which has palm leaf industrially produced, but it was based on an artisan carving based on an actual palm leaf, which was done and then industrially produced, and that to some degree is how he used artisanal methods, but then used any industrial invention which was there to make it possible to build his houses.
It's very interesting, and I do like trying to get my head around how this Catalan history becomes the kind of impetus for his own design work. Do you see that as being an emergent thread in his work? Did this start off him trying to be the contemporary architect for his period, but slowly starting to assimilate some of this kind of historicist, Gothic or medieval perhaps sensibilities? And of course there's the integration of nature into his work, which I think we can come on to in a second. But does this grow in his work, or is it always there from the very beginning? Is there evidence to suggest that despite the lack of, as you say, written or very much data on the fella, is there a sense that he was always pursuing this line?
I wouldn't know. I think one of the answers I could make is that he was extremely eclectic when he started. I think he was very lucky in the Barcelona Architecture School, which developed a very big photographic library in the 1870s, which meant that he didn't have to travel to India to actually see how Indians built things. He didn't have to travel to Egypt to see what was happening in Cairo. He actually had books available. He was the first generation to have books available, and it was a very open school. And I think his two biggest original influences, which are there in the Casa Vicens, his first house, is what we call Orientalism, which is a type of Moorish architecture, which of course is very common throughout Spain. He devoured books. Interestingly, in the university library now, there are books on Moorish architecture with annotations in Gaudi's hands, because the man had no respect for library books. He sometimes tore them up, evidently, but he also, instead of buying the damn things, he'd write it in the margins. And so there are these extremely valuable nowadays books with Gaudi's own notes saying, good heavens, or that's interesting, or I'd like to do that. But it shows that he was very, very interested in what was a great rage and a great fashion in the Europe of the 1880s, 1870s, which was Orientalism. And in architecture, that became, in art, it was often nude women in harems. But in architecture, it became Moorish towers, very thin pinnacles, were giving a sense of climbing up to heaven, which Gaudi particularly enjoyed, integrating these towers into his early buildings. And also the Moorish use of brick, which, although he had Gothic, which was there, and the actual university was a neo-Gothic building in which he lived or he studied for several years. And then he had this Orientalist influence as well. So I don't think his great completed Gaudi buildings, which come from the early 20th century, were, looking back, they're obviously implicit in what he was doing in the early 1880s. But I'm not clear, and who would know, but I'm not clear that he was particularly clear in his mind where he was going. He was just, the Casa Vicens is incredibly creative, jumble of everything. People like Robert Hughes or Pevsner found it quite shocking, not at all what respectable architects should be doing.
You talk about, in the beginning of the book, you talk about Gaudi's contradictions, politically conservative, and yet I suppose in a way within the context of the new nation of Spain, actually not that conservative in so far as he was proposing a separatist movement for Catalonia. And obviously he was very revolutionary as an architect.
I didn't hear the noise from here at all. You heard it, but I couldn't hear it.
It's just, we have technical staff and they run this place like it's their personal fiefdom without any respect for anybody trying to do anything. It's very odd. Every time I put recording up outside the door, they start smashing tables around like it's fun. Anyway, so to start again. Obviously, Gaudi is a man of contradictions, as you've pointed out, sort of politically conservative.
Yeah.
Descriptions, architecturally revolutionary, personally very austere. And that was quite a surprise to read that in your book about the way that his austerity, nearly starving himself to death kind of thing. And yet his buildings were extraordinarily extravagant and extremely expensive.
Yeah.
How does this work in him? And how does this sort of, in a way, become a driver for his work as a designer?
The short answer is I haven't the first idea. But I think another factor in the background in which he was living was the anarchist movement, which was an openly revolutionary movement, which dominated in the working class. If you imagine that it was anarchists who dominated the Labour Party, then conservative people in Britain would be extremely worried. And Gaudi and his contemporaries were... The contradiction of Catalan nationalism is that they depended on the Spanish army to defeat the anarchists, or to keep the anarchists cowed or at bay. And in the various general strikes in Gaudi's lifetime, there were always many people killed in these general strikes. They're very violent events. The army suppressed them. And yet also, in terms of Catalan nationalism, they were against this very same army. They wanted space for their own autonomous government, which Madrid denied. And at the end of Gaudi's life, when there was a dictatorship from 1923, all Catalan movements were explicitly forbidden. So that's another factor, the anarchist movement. So when we say he's very conservative, he allied himself with conservatives in that sense. He was also became very Catholic in the late 80s, 1890s, and the Art Nouveau movement tended to be dominated in people's minds and in reality by lots of young men usually sitting around drinking absinthe or holding parties, symbolists, somewhat decadent. And the Gaudi side of that was very much against values, against that. He said, he rejected, he's seen nowadays as an Art Nouveau architect, but he rejected the very word Art Nouveau. For him, it was French and decadent and women drinking in bars, which was absolutely terrible. And there was a famous painting by Ramon Casas, who was a Catalan impressionist, of women drinking in bars, which Gaudi abhorred. So I haven't answered your question really, but I think that started off very eclectic and became very religious for many reasons, became more and more nationalist. And that for me is a puzzle. It's separate from the development of his architecture. All those things are in his architecture. He puts in Catalan nationalist symbols, Catholic symbology. But, the fact that he's got quotes of the Virgin Mary, about the Virgin Mary written on the walls of a house, doesn't stop the house being gloriously colorful and exotic. So I don't think I can answer that. I mean, I don't know how his contradictions worked out in his architecture.
Well, I quite like this idea of this contradiction. I quite like this idea of the possibility of an artist's work not representing the inner workings of their heart. I personally find this idea that one can understand the author by the words that they write.
Yeah.
It's always made me feel a little bit uneasy.
Well, it's the old problem, isn't it? How much a person, an artist's life has to do with what they actually produce. Obviously, I mean, talking about Gaudi, I think we've already said, and it's important to put down the social, political influences, the world in which he grew up. But from there, the way he led his life doesn't connect very obviously to the buildings he produced.
He does seem to have worked relentlessly hard, however. You mentioned, for example, the fact that he slept on site for some of his work. This idea that a total masterwork of the kind that he designed requires absolute personal dedication. It's not separate from his life as a...
No.
Which I think is quite fascinating. I suppose that the one that we look to, the modernist that we look to, because Gaudi is peculiarly enough a modernist architect, is he not? But the one we look to is Le Corbusier, where we try and find correspondence between what we see to be his political beliefs and his buildings, or his social ethical beliefs and his buildings. And we say, well, he was a bit of a fascist and his buildings all corralled people into kind of X, Y, and Z in a kind of, or look at his work in Addis Ababa and, you can see the correspondence, or Chandigarh or whatever. And I guess that's what people are hoping to see, are hoping to understand in the work of someone like Gaudi, is that this kind of Baroque architecture. Is that fair? Baroque?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a lot of Baroque. Yeah, though it's a word I'm not sure I know how to define, but
stuff.
Yeah,
lots of
it's
stuff.
It's a cliche to say it, but it's worth saying. I mean, he was very much married to his work. I mean, he wanted to. It's very clear from the few writings that do exist that he wanted to get married and have a big family, because his original family all died very young, except for his father and his niece, and he proposed marriage to a very unsuitable young woman because she was Republican, a divorcee, a free thinker, whereas Gaudi was a Catholic and a monarchist and so on and so forth. And a monarchist is wrong, but he wasn't a Republican in that sense, nor a free thinker. So she rejected him. And after his rejection, he went through a tremendous change. Instead of being something of a dandy in his younger years, and people who talk about him in cafe society, holding forth with fancy walking sticks, top hats, beautiful, colourful waistcoats, something of a 1880s dandy. He then became what we tend to see in the photos from his later life, just in working man's clothes, in old shabby clothes, couldn't care less what he looked like. Instead of being quite a big, broad man, usually people get fatter as they get older. Gaudi got slimmer as he got older. When he was young, he was big and so big-shouldered in his pictures, quite tall he looked. And in his older years, after his big religious crisis when he nearly died in 1893 or 4, I think, he suddenly became slim and hunched, and he looked like the old man of his later photographs. So it's difficult to find a direct correspondence, like you say, Le Corbusier with his straight lines and concrete and glass and fascist. I mean, you can make that somewhat stupid connection, perhaps, but common connection. But with Gaudi, it's not so clear. And yeah, he married his architecture, flung himself into his architecture. And he was also had very much social purposes. I mean, he used to attack priests a lot and attack the church a lot because they were too aloof from the working class. He saw himself as part of a religious movement whose job was to draw working class people away from godless anarchism to a proper religious ordered life. And he saw his buildings in those terms. So in that sense, his austere life, he saw his buildings as being designed to influence society. I'm not sure they influenced society how he wanted, because it was later the surrealists after his death who exalted, the godless surrealists who exalted his work. But he saw a lot of his buildings and a lot of his the work he did, the school he set up at the Sagrada Família in order to educate workers' children in proper religious ways. He saw a lot of his work as proselytizing religion among the poor and the working class. So in that respect, one can make connections.
Yeah. The use of nature in his work is obviously extremely well documented and is what he's known for. The use of kind of what I suppose these days would be called biomorphic forms.
Well, I'm not sure I understand that. Yeah, no, I do understand that. The shape of life, yeah.
The biomorphic kind of, qualities of it, the organic qualities. Where did this impetus come from? Was this, like it had been in those architects I mentioned before, like Pugin, a sort of a rejection of the grossness of a lot of the industrial infrastructure and spaces that were made for those working class people that you've mentioned? Or was it something other? Was it more like that analogical, anagogical architecture of the medievalists? What is the sense here in terms of...
I think a lot of his contemporary architects, famous contemporary architects in Catalonia, did not integrate nature into their buildings nearly as much as Gaudi. So it's something fairly specific to him. I have a feeling that this is what people, I mean, it's not my view, it's what is often said about him by commentators, that he grew up a somewhat sickly child in the country, and he was very observant of nature. I mean, in all his buildings, there's spirals, everything is round. He himself said, God's nature has nothing square in it. Everything is squiggly, everything is round. Everything is rough. There's nothing actually square and polished. And that came to a great extent, I think, from, or it is thought, from his youth in the countryside, from observing. He spent many weeks, sometimes sitting in a wheelchair, observing snails, looking at leaves, looking at tree trunks. All of which are very, very much present in his later work. I think then in the School of Architecture, there was the question of nature was quite present. I think I'm not clear about it. You would know better than this, but people like William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, it's not clear whether Gaudi actually read those people, but it is clear that their books were in the library in translation at times in the university, in the architecture school of the university, and courses were given about their views and their books, or touching on their views and books. But I tend to think the whole thing of nature does come very much from Gaudi's childhood, and any sort of later reading he did was amplifying what he'd learned in the country, in the country village where he grew up.
How was this use of nature received publicly and I suppose critically as well by the profession at large? Or is there any knowledge about that?
Gaudi was very scandalous. I mean, I think he was quite provocative and liked being scandalous. He didn't seem to worry that people shouted at him or criticized him, but which always worries me and may worry you. People usually worry about people criticizing them too much.
What is he understood to be a genius in his own time?
I think he wasn't, I mean, I don't think he became really famous until the 1900s. I think in the first 20 years of his career, he was known, he was wealthy, but he wasn't this tremendously famous, idiosyncratic character, which he became. I mean, people, once you got to 1900, you could say that everyone in Spain or in Catalonia had heard of Gaudi, though they might not know what he was doing, in the same way that one hears of famous artists or politicians today. I've lost a thread there.
What was the critical reception of his buildings?
Yeah, I think he was, in his studies, he was idiosyncratic. He did enough to pass his course, but he was quite criticized even as a student for spending too much time on his own studies in the library and not enough time on coursework, some of which he found boring, evidently. Domenico Montaner, who was a very fine contemporary architect, a couple of years older than Gaudi, was extremely hostile to Gaudi and wrote numerous articles in the press criticizing Gaudi's eclecticism. And his work is very eclectic. I'm not sure if I've said it already, but people like Robert Hughes and Pevsner, even in the 1960s and 70s, were trying to come to grips with the fact that these things were outrageously outre, eclectic combinations of things. You don't put a Moorish tower beside a Gothic wall. You don't do these things. But he fused that in his later life, but he was always, I think, controversial. He was always criticized, and people found him very difficult to understand. I think later, more and more, he was accepted because he was seen as a glory of the nation and a famous person, and people came from the king of Spain came to look at his buildings. Rich people like Eusebio Guel, one of the richest men in Spain, financed him, so he had his supporters.
I suppose that's part of the way that architecture works, isn't it? You get these figures who in their younger years of practice are seen as being discrepant and anarchistic, and as their stock rises, they're slowly enfolded back into the center of the profession as they gain disciples there. This is sort of the way that architectural production and the story of architecture emerges, is through this kind of going to the edges and being re-enfolded by the nature of the profession itself. It's almost a character of it.
Yes, so someone very outstanding comes to define what is good in a later generation, what is sort of worth looking at. And certainly that's happened with Gaudi. You can see that in literature, which was books rejected at first, become, classic texts 50 years afterwards. And that's certainly so with Gaudi.
Did he have followers? Were there folk that came after him who were within the school of Gaudi? Because obviously Mies had them, Le Corbusier had them, various architects of great stature, Lloyd Wright and so on and so forth, have had their disciples, and people, you can look at buildings and say, oh yeah, clearly they sit within that part of the modernist canon. They sit within that part. Are there known examples of people that have been decidedly inspired by the Gaudi-esque movement?
I think yes and no. I mean, in his time, students, one of the complaints of a school of architecture was that students would come and literally sit at Gaudi's feet to hear his thoughts about architecture instead of going to their classes in the school. So in that sense, he had a big influence on generations of architects in Spain. But then again, in Spain itself, there was a rupture. The civil war and Francoism meant there was no continuity. There was very little intellectual continuity between the first years of the 20th century and then the Republic. And then after 1936-39, the 40 years of the dictatorship meant that creative people shut up or were killed or went into exile. I think in terms of a school of Gaudi, people say there isn't. David Mackay, who was English but a Barcelona architect for 50 years, Mackay has always said that Gaudi never had any influence on architects, but he had great vernacular influence in that people, ordinary builders, I mean, around where I live in the neighborhood of Barcelona, there's lots of houses with little designs of them or little animals' heads popping out or rounded parabolic arches. I mean, Gaudi wouldn't have liked this because his parabolic arches were integral parts. He didn't like stuff stuck on. These later imitators of what was a Gaudi type house was some person having his or her house built when it might be the 1980s, who said, oh yeah, stick me some detail that looks like Gaudi, so we have a sort of painted on the front of the house. There's a lot of that around Barcelona. So as Mackay said, there's no school of Gaudi, but he had an influence on vernacular, ordinary architecture, which actually makes parts of Barcelona quite interesting. Ordinary rows of terrace houses have fancy little bits on them at times. Santiago Calatrava says that he's inspired by Gaudi, but Calatrava is a strange character, and he certainly talks a lot in terms of nature, and he, puts a lot of natural stuff into his work. But I'm not sure how much you can really say that there's a school of Gaudi. Enric Miralles, who was a Catalan who died young, designed the Scottish Parliament, was a great fan of Gaudi. But looking at Miralles' work, there's lots of colour, there's lots of wiggles, there's lots of rounded edges. And I suppose you can say that comes from Gaudi, but it's a very general sort of comment to say that. I don't think there's a real Gaudian school.
No, I suppose the connection I'd make between Miralles and Gaudi is that Gaudi's Sagrada Família has become emblematic of Catalonia. It's this kind of idea of an architecture that is so distinct from anything you might see anywhere else that it's become emblematic. And what EMBT do, Enrique Miralles and Beatrice Tagliabue, what they do in Edinburgh is try and kind of consolidate Scottish identity into a very frilly piece of kind of almost, metaphorical space making.
Yeah.
Architecture as the heart of a nation kind of thing, which Pugin had done at the Houses of Parliament and,
Mm-hmm.
so on and so forth.
I haven't seen the Parliament building in Scotland, but I've read quite a bit and seen photos of it, but it works in that way, as you say. So that's clearly part of Catalan nationalism transposed to Scotland. One can say it comes from Gaudi. Catalan nationalists are very, very keen on the parallels with Scotland, which are all quite often not very close, but they like to talk about how Scotland is also an oppressed nation like Catalonia, and Miralles and Josefina Tagliabue had that very much in their mind when they were doing the Parliament in Edinburgh. But no, I think we have to say that Gaudi has no particular school, but he created a something which is Sagrada Familia is unique, really, an overused word, but one can't imagine it being imitated. The particular combination of influences that he put into the cathedral.
I just want to finish with one last question, I suppose, on Sagrada Familia. They're still building it. Allegedly, it will one day be finished, if a Gothic cathedral can ever be finished. But that ongoing debate about its completion has a long history. And Le Corbusier, again, Miro, as you mentioned earlier, they were involved in discussions around whether it should be or shouldn't be. As its identity, as the identity of the cathedral has changed, do you think that this is something that has started to inflect it? It's like become this kind of big problem to demonstrate Catalonian competence and ability to finish things, or is it something else entirely?
I don't think it touches that much on Catalan business abilities, or I don't think people see it so much in that way. Yeah, whether it will be finished or not, as you say, is an open question. It is very strongly supported by the Catholic Church. When Benedict the 16th, the Pope before last, came to consecrate the nave in 2007, he chose to do it on the 7th of November, which was the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So the original idea of the Sagrada Familia, which was to expiate the sins of Catalonia, rather like, I can't think what it's called now, but there's something done in Paris to expiate the sins of the Paris Commune, is still very much in Catholics' minds, and the whole move to make a saint of Gaudi is very much in Catholics' minds. So although almost everyone sees the Sagrada Familia as a symbol of Barcelona and as a big tourist attraction, the biggest tourist attraction in Spain, and it's quite incredible. I don't know if you've been there. It's quite incredible to walk past it. You can't walk past it. You have to go right round because it's full of people with their cameras making selfies or taking pictures of it. Full of stalls selling scarves or pottery, or quincalla, or the trinkets of Gaudi mania, and so I think there's a impulse to finish it from the church. It's problematic because to really finish it, they'd have to knock down a city block, which for many reasons the people living there don't want to happen. And the city council thinks that it's unreasonable to knock down a whole city block in order to build an enormous ramp leading up from the facade of glory, which is yet to be done. So it won't be fully finished. And yeah, it's an employment agency. It's also a religious icon.
One last question. What can we learn, or what do you think architects or people who do design can learn from Gaudi's approach, his social and political? Do you feel in his work that the social and the political come together in a particularly instructive or fruitful way that has kind of greater import and possible value? And I appreciate that you are not an architect, and so you might feel like you're stepping on people's toes, but everybody's opinion is of equal merit here.
No, I think I mean, as we just said about the Sagrada Familia, politically, his work is still very valid for right-wing movements and for Catholic movements, and in another sense also for Catalan nationalist movements, which can be right-wing or can be left-wing. I don't think that Gaudi's buildings are nearly all in Barcelona, and so they have a tremendously strong presence in Barcelona, and not just him, but buildings which are equally good or equally beautiful by his contemporaries, especially Puig i Cadafalch and Jujol and Domènech i Muntaner, some fantastic buildings. And Domènech i Muntaner is interesting because he built social buildings. He built a hospital, he built a music palace for the workers, and he very explicitly wanted to build a new Catalonia, a future Catalonia, which was socially progressive, which did away with old hospitals where no one wanted to go because you'd immediately die once you went in there in the old medieval hospital, built new hospitals which were open with lots of grass and trees around, which were nice places to be ill in. And Gaudi was not like that. I mean, Gaudi was very masochistic in his personal beliefs, very very limited in his worldview. And I think one can only say that his influence in a social sense is basically a religious influence. In his artistic sense, I mean, he's saying that you can do anything. You can stick a Gothic, a neo-Gothic wall beside a Moorish turret if you want, and so what? If it works, and if you have that instinct that you can put different things together and make people see them and enjoy them and make it work, then artistically he's saying that. But it's not a proper answer that I've given, and I don't think there is any answer really. I mean, I don't think he has great social or political influence. He's just a tremendous tourist attraction on the one hand, a religious icon on the other hand, and artistic exuberance. You know, I mean, I think one has to end at this very poor, very self-starving, very somewhat masochistic sort of character, built these incredibly exuberant buildings with all sorts of fancy animals sticking their heads out, with colors all over the place. Enrique Miralles really picks up on the colors. There's lots of colors in lots of his buildings. And it's and that was it really. I mean, it's contradictory, and I don't think I certainly can't. I don't think anyone I've read about Gaudi can solve that contradiction really. It's a bit of a one-off. One thing what is interesting, I'm rattling on, you can stop me if you want, but one thing that is interesting is that Robert Hughes in particular, I think, drew the picture of Gaudi as a solitary genius sleeping on his cot in the Sagrada Família. In fact, he was very social. He was surrounded by people. After he was turned down by Pepeta Morello, as he didn't want to be his wife, all his friends were men, but he was always surrounded by craftsmen. He would be holding forth, go out walking with people. I mean, he wasn't a lonely character, and he was always intervening in society. He was trying to make sure that the anarchists didn't win. Well, they didn't win, but that was because of the Spanish military, which Gaudi didn't like either. But so he certainly was someone who intervened in society, but basically from a religious Catalan nationalist point of view. And I don't think you can talk much about him having many followers in that sense, but he's there as a presence, and everyone likes him being there.
Great. Well, that's a good point to finish on. Thank you so very much. I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
You probably say that to everybody.
Sometimes I get up early and even my soul is wet. Far away the sea sounds and resounds. This is a port. Here I love you. Here I love you, and the horizon hides you in vain. I love you still among these cold things. Pablo Neruda. That's some hot stuff right there. Sort of apt though, ain't it just? Thanks to Michael for speaking with me and for the PDF of the book. It's a goodie, so have a butcher's, why don't you? And thanks for listening.